And I am so excited to introduce our next presenter, Ms. Emma Jensen. She was a student of mine until, how long ago? 5 years?
6 years now.
Oh my gosh! Okay, so, and I particularly wanted Emma to teach this class because she just graduated from the U and she did her honors thesis on this topic. So she did some fabulous research. I said, can you please send me your paper so I can read it? And I read it in like 15 minutes because I was just like, okay, this is amazing. And what I particularly appreciate about her research, it was just so factual and, I mean, well-researched and factual and like non-emotional, and it's information that we all need. So I am happy to have Emma here telling you about this because I want us to all appreciate what we have. So you notice the name of her research is the legacy, right? You guys know what that means. It's something that gets passed down to you. And so if you look at that pedigree chart in your packet, you might want to open it up, and I think Emma also has some other pages with the pedigree on there. But it's just really important to, and I'm not saying you have to memorize it, okay, but just to conceptualize that what you have right now in terms of your violin technique, your approach to violin, the musical and emotional approach to it has all been handed down to you from generations. So that is what I want you to take home from this, and take notes based on what Emma is giving you, because she has fought hard for this knowledge and she's giving it to you, and it's really important. So take it away, Emma.
Thanks, Emily. Yeah, I just want to quickly say why I decided to do this research, because I felt, growing up and learning this specific bow hold and technique and this, tradition that we follow, that I wasn't very aware, I guess, when I was younger of where it was really coming from. And when I tried to explain it to other people, most people don't understand. And so I felt like it was really important for me to understand where does this come from so that I can go and inform other people. Because there is quite an amount of bias, I feel like, out there in terms of our bow hold. Some of you might have experienced that. So I think it's really important that we do understand where this is coming from. So this is the history and legacy of the Russian violin bow hold. And we'll talk a little bit later about why I have quotation marks there, so it's important. Okay, so what are a couple of things that influence how you hold your bow? Why do you hold the bow the way you do? What has influenced you? Can we just get a couple? Kate, yes. Comfort, yeah, what feels best to you? I would say that's maybe your personal preference or your physical characteristics. Yeah, go ahead.
Hand size and length of fingers.
Yep, definitely. Go ahead. Yeah, so what you are able to gain from your specific bow hold. So I came up with a couple of these from my research. I realized that A is physical characteristics, so if maybe your fingers are longer or shorter than someone else's, your bow hold might look slightly different. Perhaps your arm length too will determine part of that. Personal preference as well, so something that feels comfortable to you. And then what's really super duper important is the student-teacher relationship. So I'm sure all of you have learned a lot about your bow holds from your teacher, right? They're probably the most important person in terms of helping you figure out how you're going to hold your bow. And we spend a lot of time in lessons, right, talking about bow hold. So that teacher is really important. You can usually tell who somebody studies with based on how they hold their bow and based on how that teacher holds their bow. So if Emily holds her bow in the Russian bow hold, it's very likely that I will as well, right, because she's the one teaching me. And then the influence of other mentors and virtuosos. So we'll talk about some other people that have perhaps changed bow hold styles throughout time based on, I guess, just being influenced by other people besides just their principal teacher. Okay, could I have somebody read this? It should be pretty big.
Throughout history, as pedagogical ideas spread from one violinist to another, differences in technique based on specific teacher lineages began to emerge. These diverging styles styles of playing led scholars to categorize violinists of past centuries into separate pedagogical schools.
Good, thank you. Yeah, a lot of big words that we're going to talk about. But pedagogy just really means teaching. So when we're talking about violin teaching, pedagogy, that's what that's coming from. Now, the reason that I bring this up is that sometimes we think, oh, the bohold is a certain way because of a certain country that someone lives in and those characteristics. But really, it's because of the teacher lineages. So don't get confused as we start talking about this teacher was from here and this one from here and this one from here. It's more important that you're seeing how they connect. And I'm going to pass out a little genealogy, I guess, lineage tree, and we have one in your books as well. So as you're looking at that, keep in mind that just because one person is Russian and the next person is Russian doesn't mean they're playing with the same bow hold. It's the teacher lineage that's really important.
Also, can I just insert one thing?
Yes.
It's important to note also that like every violinist on these charts is going to be, and including us, including Emma and me, we are all the product of more than one influence. So you might hear like the expectation to change your bow hold from one to the other is just like the end of the world, okay? But it actually, every teacher that you go to is going to change something. Even if, like, I had somebody go from me to Heidi, right? We share the same, we both studied with Igor Vezirgman, so, but there are still things that we individually have developed over time. So if I had a student go from me to Heidi, Heidi is still going to do things differently. So, I'm sorry to interrupt, but that, to understand that not everything on these charts or every person on these charts has a strict, like a straight, there's just way more to it, and there's a lot of nuance to how you hold the bow and the influences that you choose to keep and that you choose, or that you don't. So.
Yeah, and it makes it a little tricky when I was doing research to actually come up with a good lineage chart, because like she said, there's multiple teachers and you have to keep in mind that maybe they changed their bow hold later. So you'll see that I have some dashed lines. In fact, I'm just going to pass this out now. I only have 10 copies, so if you're related or you're sitting by people, you can look at this. And I'm happy to send anybody anything from my thesis later as well. So go ahead and just maybe take one and pass them around to, yeah, there should be 10. But yeah, you'll see some dashed lines, and because maybe they studied with one teacher and then they came back later and studied with someone else. Okay, so this idea of schools, violin schools, I usually think of them as being a building, a place. But that's not necessarily what these schools are when we're talking about them. If you look on the paper that I'm passing out, you'll see that I've got little boxes, and they'll say like Russian violin school, Italian violin school. So we're going to talk a little bit about each one of those so you can kind of see how ideas spread throughout Europe from the beginning of the violin, right? So the earliest school that we have was the Italian school. So this started around the 17th century, and this is when Italy was the center of music education in Europe. So it was the musical center. All the bigwigs, basically. That means they all lived in Italy. And of course, if you think of the violin makers that were really famous at that time, Stradivari, Amati, they're all Italian, right? So this is where everything is coming from. It wasn't tied to a specific school. So when we say Italian violin school, there's no building. It's not like a university or anything, or a conservatory. There's no building that this is associated with. This is just saying all these people were of the same school of thought. So major violinists would be Corelli, Vivaldi, Tartini, Veracini, and Locatelli. Raise your hand if you've played anything by one of these 5 guys. Good. Tartini concerto is pretty common, right? Vivaldi, we've all played probably lots and lots of Vivaldi. So these guys are going to be at the top of that violin pedigree, because these are the, I guess, what we consider the first pedagogues and violin teachers. So they influenced the next generation. And now it didn't obviously stay in Italy. This tradition now went to France. And as you know, ideas move and continue, people have personal preferences. They have different shapes of arms. They have different ideas. And so things change, like bow hold. And so something called the French school originated, and it had different techniques and styles and, music than what was originating in the Italian school. So this was 19th century. Now this was linked specifically to a school, which was the Paris Conservatory. So that was the first conservatory that was like a big deal, really the first musical center with the actual location, that building. And so a lot of famous composers, conductors, and also violinists came from that Paris Conservatory around that time. And I think we know some of these violinists. Kreutzer, has anybody played Kreutzer etudes? Yep, for better or worse, that's where it comes from. Rodet also, probably some of you have done his stuff as well. Now, you'll see this name Viotti, and he's on both of those pedigree charts. So go ahead and open up your chart and find Viotti. And he's something that we call the father of the French Violin School. Now look at Viotti's name. Is he French? No, he's not French. He's actually Italian. So he brought some of these ideas from the Italian school and taught Kreutzer, and I believe he taught all three of these. Kreutzer, Viotti, I actually don't know how to say his name, but it's French, and Rodet. He taught those three, so that's why we consider him the father of the French violin school, because those three teachers branched off from him, and then on and on and on, and so on. So I bring this up, he's Italian, because just because somebody is from one country, that's their heritage, doesn't mean that that lineage is the same as what we consider in the violin school. So don't get confused and say, oh, everybody, if he has a French name, he's from the French school. That's not necessarily how it works. Sometimes this is referred to as the Franco-Belgian school, and there's more complications with that, but you can read into how those kind of co-align with that.
Can you say that one more time really loud?
The last part?
Yeah, loud.
Yeah. Okay, so sometimes it's referred to as the Franco-Belgian school, or the Belgian school is sometimes referred to separately, but there's some complications with that. So go ahead and you can do more research on that if you're curious about how those co-align. Now we have the German school. I didn't do very much research on the German school, but they're cool too, okay? Vienna Conservatory is where they were mainly located. Major violinists would be Spohr. I believe somebody is playing the Spohr concerto. Oh, it's Cynthia. She'll be playing it tomorrow. So Spohr comes from this school, and Joachim, which I think he's pretty well known as well. So also keep in mind Joachim, because we're going to talk about one of his students later. Yeah.
I think Suzuki is a product of the German school.
That's right. Yeah, he is. I think he studied, was it with Joachim?
Well, we
No,
have
it would have been much
Joachim
later.
On here, Joachim going to Klingler and then Suzuki in the upper left.
So we had some teacher that was from that line. A lot of times too, when you'll see concertos, at least the editions I've played, Joachim has done a lot of, I guess, editing on some of those. So he's an important guy. And then finally, we have our lineage, I guess you could consider, or at least part of our lineage, because you might have teachers that were coming from other ones. But the Russian school, which was the latest of all of these four schools, which would be about mid-19th century, so end of the 1800s and beginning of the early 1900s is when this is coming about. It was tied specifically to the St. Petersburg Conservatory. That's on your bingos, so if you didn't get it. And so I have a picture of that I'll show in just a second. But the major violinists were, by violinists I say major teachers, because keep in mind there's a lot of violinists belonging to this school. The major pedagogues were Wieniawski and Leopold Auer. So those were those two. Yes?
Did the shape and design of the bow change much over this time period?
Yes, definitely. And that's part of the reason that these ideas are changing. So when you're looking at Italian school, this is more of Baroque era, right? The curved bow is starting to flatten out. By the time you're looking at the 19th century, the bow looks more similar to what we have today. So it's not curved anymore. So that did affect their bow hold. And I'll show you some of basically Leopold Mozart's drawings of how he had held the bow, and you'll see that it's a little different, obviously, than what we do today because of that. There are some that talk about an American school, And there's some debate about whether that really exists or not. If the American school can be considered as a separate school, the major pedagogue of that would be Galamian. I don't know if you have heard of him. Galamian, and then the influence from Suzuki as well, and then Paul Roland is another pedagogue that was famous in basically the mid-20th century. So there are some people that also talk about the American school. Today, the influence of these schools is still really important, but we don't distinguish ourselves by them. You don't go and show up at a rehearsal and say, well, I'm from this school, and it's important to know who you're studying with, but we don't talk about these other than to really understand our history, if that makes sense. And if you have any questions, just raise your hand. Do we have any questions up to this point about anything about the violin schools? No, I will continue. I had a picture of the conservatory. Oh yeah, here it is, right here. So that's St. Petersburg Conservatory, and we're going to talk a little bit more about it in a minute, but just wanted to show you what it looked like.
St. Petersburg Conservatory, and then is that significantly earlier than Moscow Conservatory?
So I don't actually know when Moscow Conservatory was, originated, but it was famous before. So we'll talk about this, but after Leopold, Auer, and Wieniawski left St. Petersburg Conservatory, it wasn't as well known, and pretty much everybody moved over to Moscow. So today, Moscow Conservatory would be the bigger school of the two, pretty much after Auer left, which was like 1917. So anytime after that, Moscow is the center. But up until then, St. Petersburg was the main place to go study music. And we'll talk a little bit more about how that started. So we've discussed this, but basically labeling schools of the past, Italian, German, French, Russian, leads us to associate certain techniques with certain countries, but realize that it's more an accurate description of who they studied with, right, rather than their nationality. So nationality of individual violinists cannot be inferred from the violin school necessarily that they attended. People were moving across Europe. If you were a really talented violinist from one country, you would come to the Paris Conservatory in that early 19th century because that was the place to study, right? And if you were a really talented violinist later on, maybe you would have gone to a different conservatory. So just keep that in mind. Like I said, Viotti was Italian. Wieniawski and Auer of the Russian school were Polish and Hungarian. So neither of them were actually from Russia originally. Okay, so here's the picture. I don't know that whoever has the little handout, some of you have it, but here's the larger picture of it. So Italian school up there at the top, Tartini, Corelli, and I've added a couple other important figures in there as well. The French school directly breaks off from Italian school, right? But then you see more of a, spread like this. So this is all happening more in the same time period, whereas 1690, in those early times, it was mostly just Italy that was the center of music. So go ahead and you can trace the lines through, but it's really interesting to see where some of these violinists are coming from in terms of their lineage. So
you said the dotted line signifies what?
Dotted lines signify just they studied with those people from certain sources that I could find, but it wasn't their principal teacher. So like Galamian, he mostly studied with Mostras, but there's also evidence, I think he studied with Capet earlier in his life, so you can see he's down there, but he also has that little line right there. Same with Leopold Auer. His main teacher was Joachim, but there are some sources that say he studied with Don't earlier in his life, so I believe it's like in his teenage years, and then early college he was with Don't, and then later with Joachim. So I tried to put the solid lines of being the principal influence on that violinist, but the dotted lines, dashed lines, signify other influences. And of course, there's much more than that's shown on here. There's way more influences that they would have had from other performers and from other people they were with. And it's a work, that chart is a work in progress, so I was constantly updating it throughout my research, and I'm sure that in another 10 years it might look a little different as we discover more things. Okay, can somebody read this slide? Go ahead, Kate.
The term Russian Leopold is used for consistency and clarity as a way of distinguishing it from other letters as
Perfect. So the reason that we talked about this earlier in terms of different schools is that putting those geographic locations, or Italy, Germany, France, was an easy way of being able to distinguish different techniques or different styles. But it is limiting, right? Because all of us here who say we use the Russian bowhold aren't. Sometimes I get people that are confused. They're like, well, did you have a teacher that was from Russia? And well, yes, but no, but it gets complicated, and that's not what it's about. It's the fact that we have lineage coming from Leopold Auer. So I think it's still important to understand that Russian is a limiting term. And so if we just simply use that, people aren't going to be aware of where it's coming from. Some people believe that we should now just call it the Auer bowhold, and we'll talk a little bit more about Auer and why that might be a good idea. But for consistency and clarity, Russian is the most commonly used term for our technique today. But anyways, that's why there's the quotation marks, because that's just something to be aware of. And when I was talking to Igor Groupman about 2 years ago, this is something that I discussed with him, because I think, it is really easy for people to judge or just come up with generalizations about where you're from or why you play a certain way without actually understanding the technique behind it and where it's coming from. Okay, so where did the Russian bowhold come from? Does anybody know? I mean, we have answers here. They're in your bingo too, but anybody have an idea who was the first person that played this way?
That's a multiple choice question.
No, these are all ideas. These are answers. I mean, but does anybody already know? Have you already discovered, okay, this was the first person? Or anybody want to make a guess? Was it Leopold Auer? We've talked about him a couple times. He's shown up on your thing. Wieniawski? Somebody played Wieniawski today. It was beautiful. So the answer to the question is, we're not exactly sure. Leopold Auer, we know for sure, started what we call the Russian bowhold, but there is some evidence that it started before that. So we'll talk about this. Let's talk about Wieniawski first, because he was born obviously 10 years before Auer. We play a lot of his music in orchestra, but also as violinist, he wrote a lot of really beautiful pieces. So I believe there are just 2 violin concertos. Did you play, that's the second violin concerto, right? Second movement. Yeah, it's beautiful. He was from a musical family. He was Polish. And so at that time, the center of music was France, so Paris. So he went to Paris Conservatory to study. And while he was in Paris, he actually met a pianist called Anton Rubinstein. You probably have heard of him. He was very famous during that time. So he met Rubinstein, and he got to know him. They had performed a couple times together. And so he was actually, because of that connection, Rubinstein was basically starting up what is now the St. Petersburg Conservatory. He was beginning that school in Russia, and he invited Wieniawski to come and be a professor there. So in 1860, Wieniawski moved to St. Petersburg, and he became the head violin professor of what became the St. Petersburg Conservatory. It wasn't called that initially. He was faculty there for 12 years, so 1860 to 1872. Now the thing about Wieniawski is that he had this training from France, from the Paris Conservatory, but he also had some Slavonic traditions coming from his home country. And so there is evidence to suggest that this, what we call the Russian bowhold, actually came from Wieniawski, of his combination of these 2 techniques. He inspired a lot of talented violinists to come move to St. Petersburg to study with him. So this is when the conservatory really starts to become a big deal, because violinists know that Wieniawski is really, really talented as a performer, but also as a teacher, so they all want to come study with him. He was more of a performer than a pedagogue. When we talk about Auer, we're going to talk more about him. He was just a fantastic teacher. He played very well, but that was not his focus. So Wieniawski, he was mainly there to play in the big halls, to be part of the quartets, and to be part of I believe it's the Russian Musical Society that was there in St. Petersburg. And so part of the reason Rubinstein invited him was to come bring his, talented abilities to the city and, boost it up like that. There was a critic. So this is the evidence that I found from Wieniawski, starting, I guess, our Russian Bohold, would be this quote from a critic that heard him play in St. Petersburg. And they said that Wieniawski held his right elbow rather high and pressed the bow with his index finger, so our index finger right there, and above the second joint. So a lot of times before that, it was this joint right here, right? First or second joint. So the fact that he was above the second joint, to me, indicates that that's our Bohold, right? It's going to be a little higher. There's also evidence that Wieniawski, as the main concert violinist in St. Petersburg, made adjustments to his technique in order to produce a bigger tone to fill the city concert hall. So if you think about that, if that aligns with what the tradition that we follow, right? Big tone, index finger, the contact point right here is a little higher, and then also a little bit of a higher elbow, right? Than that, so that we can use the weight. So
you're saying he devised those changes in order to...
Yeah, to project. Yeah, and that is from the research that I found, and also just from direct quotes of people that listened to him play at the time. It's really hard because Wieniawski, we don't have any recordings, at least that I could find, of him playing. Obviously no video recordings, and very few images actually of him. It's just far enough back. So it's really hard to actually say specifically, oh, he played with that certain Bohold. And I mean, this is before that actually really existed, so no one was going to say, oh, that's the Russian Bohold, because it didn't exist yet. But there is evidence to believe that really it was him that brought these techniques to St. Petersburg. And now that leads us to Leopold Auer. He was born a little bit after Wieniawski. He was Hungarian. And so in Hungary, he would have been closer to Germany, right? He went and studied in the Vienna Conservatory with Jacob Don't. If you've ever done some of Dont's lovely exercises, that's where they come from. And then later Joachim. So, think again about the Paris Conservatory, France. The French Violin School happened first, and then the German school was kind of happening simultaneously with that. So this is Leopold Auer from the German school then, Wieniawski from the French school, right? In 1868, he also performed with Rubinstein, same pianist as before. This guy is really recruiting hard. And he knew that Wieniawski was about to leave the conservatory, or retire in a sense. So, he asked if Auer would come and be the new violin teacher. He was 23 years old. Okay, I'm 24. That seems very young to become a violin professor. Now, it's a well-known school, now that Wieniawski has created this legacy. So he taught there basically from the time that Wieniawski left, so 1870s until 1917. So a really long time. And throughout that time, he had a lot of students, and we'll talk about their legacy. His writings and his playing clearly define the Russian Bohold. So he talked about the Bohold, he showed how to use it, there's images of it, so we know for sure it comes from Leopold Auer. Now, if he was influenced by Wieniawski, that's where we're not exactly sure. But it makes sense that he would, because nobody else from Auer's German school was playing that way. So where else would he have gotten it from? To think about that, where would that have really come from? Unless he just came up with it out of his mind as well. He was primarily a pedagogue, so primarily a teacher, not performing as much as Wieniawski. And his most famous students were Jascha Heifetz, Misha Elman, Nathan Milstein. You've probably heard of all those three, but he actually taught hundreds of students. So there'll be a couple more we talk about. Just at the end of his life, 1918, he actually relocated to the United States. There was some unrest in Russia, and so he got up and moved to the US. He finished his teaching career at Juilliard and at the Curtis Institute. So he had also some influence on violinists here in America as well. And many of his students around that time also relocated with him due to the problems that were going on in Russia. So that's how actually a lot of us have the Bohold that we have today, right? Because those violinists actually came here and taught, our teachers and teachers and teachers and so on and so forth. Again, there's the St. Petersburg Conservatory. I thought I'd put some pictures of these people we just talked about. Who wants to guess? Who is this? Any ideas? Use a 50-50 chance. That one's Leopold Auer with a beard. So this one's Wieniawski. He's not quite what I imagined. I have to say, when I pulled it up, the slicked back hair and the little mustache and the goatee. But that's Wieniawski. And you could tell, like with that arm and like with his, you know, the way he looks, I feel like that the Russian bowhold would well suit his hand to be able to get that power from it. So, and then yeah, there's Auer as well. I like Auer's little mustache at the end too. So always makes him easy to recognize. Okay. Any questions up to this point?
Those schools still, they keep some of those schools like St. Petersburg.
Yeah, so they still exist as like institutions, but they're not as tied to one idea. So now that there's influence, you know, across the world as people can travel and, you know, you could study with somebody of all the different schools, you'll find much more of a range of what they're teaching. Yeah.
You guys are went to and taught at Juilliard. Is that kind of where Juilliard got the teaching?
You know, I think Juilliard at that point was already pretty well known, and that's why he got that position, because Leopold Auer at the time was recognized as such a good pedagogue. So when he came, they said, oh yeah, we want you. So I wouldn't necessarily say that he created the legacy of Juilliard, but it is cool to say that he did teach there, you know.